Floor 14 of Harlow Meridian Logistics. Morning light sliced across the conference room glass, thin and surgical. Ethan Calloway stood in his gray maintenance uniform and listened to the verdict of his own termination, as if listening to weather. He did not argue. He did not apologize. Not a single muscle in his face betrayed surprise. He signed. He laid his badge flat on the glass like a coin placed on a grave. He walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click, almost gentle, almost obscene. Diana Harlow watched him go, and a slow cold climbed the length of her spine. Innocent men did not accept injustice this quietly. Guilty men did not either. This was the bearing of someone who had already weighed every outcome in a dark room the night before, and chosen, with terrible precision, the price he was willing to pay. The alarm in the studio apartment on the edge of Franklinton went off at 5:45 every morning, and Ethan Calloway was always awake before it. He rose in the dark and crossed the room on bare feet to the corner where his daughter lay, curled under a quilt her mother had sewn the winter before she got sick. Sophie was 7. After the funeral, she had stopped speaking for 9 weeks. Now she spoke again, softly, as if testing whether the air could be trusted with her voice. He made her oatmeal with brown sugar. He braided her hair. He clipped a small plastic bee into the crown of her braid, because the bee had been her mother's favorite, and because a man learns, after a certain kind of loss, that the small rituals are all that keep the day from collapsing. At 6:35, he walked her to Avondale Elementary. At the gate, she looked up at him. "Daddy, are you going to be okay today?" "Yes, sweetheart. Are you?" "I think so." He crouched and hugged her. She smelled faintly of the lavender soap Claire had bought in bulk 3 years ago, as if some part of her had known she was leaving and had tried to make sure her daughter would still be able to smell home. Then he drove to work. The men and women he worked beside at Harlow Meridian Logistics did not know that he held a master's degree in industrial safety engineering from the University of Michigan, or that 3 years earlier he had been a senior consultant pulling $152,000 a year. They did not know that his wife had died of pancreatic cancer the previous January, after her insurance company had refused to cover the only clinical trial that might have bought her another 18 months. They did not know that he had walked away from Chicago because he had decided, in the numb hours after her funeral, that he did not want to sign anything that might one day kill someone else's wife. He was paid $38,000 a year at Harlow Meridian. He considered it fair. In his locker, he kept 3 things that did not belong in a maintenance locker: a small plush bee Sophie had named Miss Honey, a spare bee-shaped hair clip, and a white envelope, unsealed, with 2 words written on the front in pencil. For Sophie, in case. He had never told anyone what was inside. The company was run, on paper, by a woman named Diana Harlow. 36, cautious, she had inherited the corner office 4 years earlier when her father died of an aortic dissection in the garden of the family house in Bexley. The board he had built still addressed her as Miss Diana, softly, the way one addresses a child at a funeral. The man who actually ran the building, in the way running a building can be measured by who decides what gets fixed and what gets buried, was Craig Donovan. Her father's right hand for 20 years. Since the founder's death, he had come to regard the facility as a kind of private estate. And there was Margaret Doyle, whom everyone called Maggie, 28 years at the night reception desk, the kind of woman a company forgets to notice because she never asks to be noticed. She watched. She remembered. These were the people whose lives, on the night of March 14th, were about to collide. Tuesday, 2:07 in the morning. The night shift was running an auxiliary conveyor line because the Meridian Foods contract had a delivery cutoff on Friday. Somebody had decided to push the cold storage cycle harder than the system was built for. The temperature in sub-basement B2 had ticked up 2.5 degrees above the standard night profile. It was a small number. It was enough. In a storeroom adjacent to the conveyor, a ball valve on the ammonia return line had been weeping, invisibly, for 14 months. The inspection line item on the quarterly maintenance plan had been quietly moved, on Craig Donovan's authorization, from active to deferred, 5 quarters in a row. At 2:07, the weep became a leak. Ethan was at home, at his kitchen table, a laptop open in front of him. He had written a small monitoring program in the evenings after Sophie went to bed, because some part of him, the part he could not turn off, had noticed that the plant's environmental sensors were publishing their readings to an internal network without authentication. He had an interest. His phone buzzed 3 times, the rhythm he had set for a critical threshold. Ammonia, B2 conveyor zone, 49 parts per million. The permissible exposure limit for an 8-hour shift under OSHA standard was 25. 49 was not what an engineer would call a problem. 49 was an evacuation. He closed the laptop. He stood in Sophie's doorway for 8 seconds, watching the small shape of his daughter under her quilt. Then he locked the door behind him and drove to the plant. He took the stairs. Elevators stop and doors open and you breathe what is there. On the last landing, he pulled a handheld detector from his jacket pocket and turned it on. The reading climbed in the open air of the stairwell before he even reached the conveyor floor. 31. 36. 41. He pushed through the door. The air had a sharp sweetness to it, the kind that reminds the back of your throat that you are a small, soft animal made mostly of water. 48. 49. 51 at shoulder height. He took out his phone. He filmed the gauge face. He filmed the equipment identification plate bolted to the side of the condenser. He filmed the timestamp on his watch. 30 seconds. He sent the video to his personal email. Then he walked to the emergency cutoff. He placed his right hand on the red mushroom head switch. He said, aloud, to no one, "Lockout. Tag out. Acknowledged." He pulled the breaker. The conveyor belt groaned to a halt. Somewhere above him, a ventilation damper opened, and the emergency exhaust fans kicked in with a mechanical shriek that was, he thought, the most beautiful sound he had heard in a year. He stepped back. He waited. He did not wait long. 2:19. The service door at the far end of the corridor opened, and Craig Donovan walked through it with a laptop under his arm, the shoulders of his coat damp from outside air. He had come from his house. He had come fast. Ethan understood then, a thing he had already suspected. The emergency cutoff was wired to send an automated text to the executive on call every time it was pulled. Craig had instituted the rule himself 2 years earlier, framing it as a measure for risk management. It had never been a safety feature. It had been a tripwire. Craig walked to the environmental control panel, opened the laptop, and in 89 seconds, keyed in an administrator-level password and disabled 3 ammonia sensors remotely. When the morning audit pulled the overnight data, the readings from B2 would appear, at most, as a brief spike and a smooth recovery. Then he turned. He looked at Ethan for the first time. His voice was calm, conversational, the voice a man uses when he is arranging a meeting time. "You have 2 options, Calloway. You walk out tomorrow with a clean severance, or you stay, and you explain to OSHA why that little girl no longer has a father." He held up his phone. The photograph on the screen had been taken from the inside of a car, through a passenger side window, with a long lens. Sophie in her blue backpack walking through the gate of Avondale Elementary, her braid down her back, the bee clipped into the crown of it. The timestamp was from that morning. Ethan did not move for 4 full seconds. Then he bent down, picked up the handheld detector that had slipped from his fingers, at some point he could not remember, slid it into his jacket pocket, and walked past Craig without a word. He did not look up at the ceiling as he passed under the doorframe. He did not know what was there. The conference room on the 14th floor was a long glass rectangle with a view of the river. Ethan had never been in it. Maintenance staff were summoned to the ground floor, not the 14th. The summons had come at 8:02 by internal email, 9:47. Floor 14. Bring nothing. He arrived at 9:43. He wore the same gray coverall. 13 people in the room. Craig at the head of the table. Diana at the foot. 11 mid-level managers along the sides, all called up so that the termination would have what Craig called, in his opening remarks, the transparency of a witnessed process. Craig read the charges from a printed sheet. Willful activation of an emergency cutoff without documented cause. A 4-hour production stoppage. $47,000 in losses. Violation of the priority service clause of the Meridian Foods contract. Insubordination. He read cleanly, professionally, with numbers. The 11 managers did not look at Ethan. They looked at the polished surface of the glass, or at their own folded hands, or at the view of the river. Diana watched Ethan from the foot of the table. She did not speak. She did not take notes. She watched. Mr. Calloway, you have the right to respond. Ethan looked up once. He looked at Diana, across 8 feet of polished mahogany, for exactly 1 second. Her eyes did not move from his. He looked down at the table. He said 2 words. I sign. He signed where the flag indicated. He laid his employee badge flat beside his signature so that the badge and the pen and the signed page formed a small, neat row, as if he were leaving tools on a workbench for the next person. He stood. He walked the length of the conference room toward the door. Inside his chest, a single thought was turning over and over with the patient, terrible rhythm of a wheel he could not stop. He was, under Ohio law, a licensed professional engineer. His license carried with it a statutory duty to report any workplace condition that posed an imminent threat to public health or safety. The window, in a case involving active environmental hazard, was 24 hours. If he did not file, his license would be suspended. If he did file, Craig would know within a day. The photograph on Craig's phone the night before had not been a threat. Threats were what men made when they wanted something. The photograph had been a demonstration. Someone had stood outside Avondale Elementary the previous morning with a camera body long enough to show the weave of Sophie's braid. That person had a face. That person knew where his daughter learned to read. He reached the door. He walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click. At the foot of the long table, Diana Harlow remained in her chair. In 4 years as chief executive, she had sat through dozens of terminations. She had seen the angry ones who shouted, the frightened ones who cried, the guilty ones who tried to negotiate, the innocent ones who tried to explain. The man who had just walked out had presented as none of those. There was a 4th category she had only ever seen once. A man who signs without argument because he is protecting someone whose name must not appear in the record. Diana looked at the glass door through which Ethan Calloway had just passed. Her hands were very still on the table in front of her. Somebody in this building was being protected. She did not yet know who. The knock came at 6:43 that evening. Ethan had been sitting on the edge of the couch for most of the afternoon, still in his gray coverall. Through the peephole, he saw a man in a black coat, mid-40s, the kind of face a witness would describe later as average height, average build, nothing to say about it. He opened the chain but not the latch. The man lifted a white envelope through the gap, said nothing, and walked away down the hall before Ethan could form a word. Inside the envelope were 2 things. A photograph, printed on standard paper, Sophie, in her blue backpack, walking through the gate of Avondale Elementary. The same image Craig had shown him the night before, but committed now to paper, which meant it had been processed, handled, moved through hands. And a page of typed text, 6 lines, no letterhead, No signature. Columbus is a big city. Accidents happen. Take the severance. Leave the state. Forget what you think you saw. Ethan's right hand began to tremble against the edge of the table. It was the first time his hand had shaken since the night in B2. He reached for his phone and called the only number in his contacts he had not dialed in 18 months. Ryan Bellamy picked up on the second ring. He had been Ethan's attorney in Chicago and had come to Claire's funeral without being asked. Ethan talked for 12 minutes. When he was done, Bellamy spoke with the calm of a surgeon walking into a room. "This is federal, but one envelope is not enough for the FBI to move tomorrow morning. If you don't have someone inside that company willing to cross-check what you've got, the Bureau will tell you to collect more. And in the weeks that takes, you are in a city alone with a man who has already paid somebody to stand outside your daughter's school. Get Sophie out tonight, before sunrise. Send me the video on a secure channel within the hour." Ethan hung up. He woke Sophie gently and told her she was going to visit her aunt in Cleveland for a little while and that he loved her. She looked at him for a long moment, with the grave patience of a child who has already been told once, in her short life, that the adult standing over her bed was telling her something only half true. Then she nodded and held out her arms so that he could lift her. At 6 the next morning, he pulled into the driveway of a small brick house in Lakewood, outside Cleveland. His sister Rachel came out in her robe and took Sophie from the back seat without asking questions. Sophie had slept most of the drive. She woke on the outskirts of the city and cried quietly for the last 40 miles, the kind of crying a child does when she has understood something before an adult has said it. "Daddy, why aren't you staying?" "I have work in Columbus, sweetheart. I'll come back for you very soon." "Promise." "I promise." He sat in the car at the curb with both hands flat on the wheel until his sister had carried Sophie up the porch steps and closed the door behind them. Then he drove back toward the city he was not entirely sure he would leave alive. Diana Harlow had not slept. She sat at the kitchen counter of her penthouse in German Village at 2 in the morning and pulled internal email threads for 5 hours. She was a careful woman. She had not become chief executive by leaping at anything. What she found was this: Craig Donovan's notification email to the full board of directors announcing the termination of Ethan Callaway had been transmitted at 9:51, 4 minutes after the meeting had ended. 340 words, 5 attachments, a reconciled damages figure, an internal risk memo dated the previous week referencing, in passing, a personnel concern in facilities maintenance. No one wrote that email in 4 minutes. The memo had been drafted the night before or earlier. The termination had been prepared. What had happened at 9:47 had been a performance, and Ethan Callaway had walked into a room where the verdict had already been filed. The question was what Craig Donovan had needed to stage a firing for. Peter Walsh asked her to meet him at a coffee shop on North High Street the following afternoon. He had been her father's outside counsel for a decade before coming in-house as general counsel. He pushed a black portfolio across the table. "I've been building this for 16 months. I wasn't going to bring it to you until I had enough that the board couldn't politely move it into a committee and let it suffocate. I am not there yet. But I think you just walked into the last piece." She opened it. Shell entities. 5 of them. Legal services invoices from a firm in Cincinnati that had no record of the engagements listed. Quarterly payments to a consulting group called Vantage Crest Advisory that appeared to provide no deliverable. Wire transfer approvals that bore Craig Donovan's electronic signature, and, in the oldest records, her father's. "How much?" she said. "Preliminary. Low 7 figures. I'd want an outside forensic firm to give you a real number." "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" "Because I was not yet willing to be the one who handed the founder's daughter a folder suggesting her father might have been complicit in what was inside it." She looked at him for a long time. "Peter, I need you to be willing now." The call from Maggie Doyle came to Diana's private cell at 11:10 that night. Diana had given Maggie that number 4 years earlier, on the first evening of her tenure, when she had walked through the lobby after a 13-hour day, and the night receptionist had looked up and said, quietly, "Miss Harlow, if you ever need somebody in this building after hours who isn't going to run to a boardroom with it, you come to me first." Maggie's voice on the line was steady and low. "Miss Harlow, I have worked in this building for 28 years. I know what it looks like when a man has decided to trade something away. Mr. Calloway just made a very large decision in your conference room. I do not know what it was, but I think you should go and find out. I have his address." "Yes," Diana said. Ethan's apartment had a single overhead light and a brown carpet that had been there since the building was constructed. When he opened the door that night, he looked at Diana Harlow for 4 seconds without moving. Then he stepped back to let her in. He did not offer her a seat. There was only a couch, a kitchen table, and 2 mismatched chairs, and the couch had a folded blanket on it that she realized was his bed. She set Peter Walsh's portfolio on the table. Ethan read standing up, with one hand flat on the table to steady the pages. He read for 3 minutes. When he was finished, he closed the folder and looked at her for the first time since she had entered the room. "He came down to the basement 19 minutes after I pulled the breaker," he said. Everything else came out in the next 20 minutes. The 49 parts per million, the monitoring program, the tripwire alert Craig had built into the emergency cutoff, the 89 seconds of remote sensor disablement, the photograph of Sophie, the man in the black coat, the envelope sealed now in a freezer bag on the counter between them. He pulled his phone from his pocket and brought up the 30-second video. He handed it to her. She watched it twice through. Then she forwarded it to Peter Walsh's secure line without asking permission. She stood at the kitchen table with her coat still on, and she looked across it at this man she had, 36 hours earlier, sat at the opposite end of a conference table from, and failed to see. "I'm sorry," she said. Ethan looked at her. "Don't. Not yet. When this is over, if we're both still standing, you can say it. Not now." She nodded once. She picked up her purse and walked out. The night after Diana's visit, Ethan drove out to Worthington and sat on Maggie Doyle's back porch for almost 2 hours. She brought him coffee and did not ask any questions. Near the end of the second hour, he said something very quietly, without looking up from his cup. "I have prepared my whole life for the worst, Maggie. I have never once prepared for the best." She did not answer. She reached across the small painted table and put her hand over his wrist for a moment. That was all. Diana drove from Franklinton to the family house in Bexley without stopping. The house had been empty since her father's death. She unlocked the front door with a key she had not used in 18 months and walked through the dark hallway to her father's study. The safe was behind a watercolor of Lake Erie her mother had painted in the 1980s. The letter she was looking for was 7 pages, handwritten, dated 3 days before her father's death. She unfolded it on his desk under the green-shaded lamp and read it all the way through for the first time. Page 5 stopped her. Her father had written, in the careful slanted hand she had grown up watching him use on birthday cards, that he had begun to suspect Craig Donovan of something he could not yet prove. That the name that kept surfacing in the quarterly ledgers was Vantage Crest Advisory. That he intended, as soon as he was back from the cardiologist the following Monday, to ask Peter Walsh to open a quiet file on it. He had never made it to Monday. Diana sat in her father's chair under the green lamp, and for a full minute, she could not tell whether the cold climbing her spine was relief or grief. She called Evelyn Parker, the company's chief financial officer, at 2 in the morning. She asked for a preliminary forensic walk of every payment made to Vantage Crest Advisory. Evelyn delivered it in 4 days. $4,300,000, routed through 5 shell entities over 3.5 years. But the crucial finding was earlier in the report. Vantage Crest had been incorporated in 2019 as a legitimate dormant vehicle for a port infrastructure project that had ultimately gone to another bidder. Her father had approved the early retainer payments when the entity was real. Craig had retained the name after the project died, used its familiarity, its invisibility, precisely because it had always been there, to move new money through it after the founder's death. Her father had not been complicit. He had died before there had been anything to be complicit in. She called her mother, Meredith, in Naples, at 6:30 the next morning. Meredith listened without interrupting. When Diana finished, her mother's voice came through the line soft and clear. "If you carry this all the way through and discover he was wrong, you will have to live with that. If you stop and pay somebody to keep quiet, you will have to live with that too. Your father would choose the right thing even when it hurt him. Do not pretend he would choose it the other way, just to spare you." The call from Maggie came 2 nights later. Diana was in the 3rd-floor IT room with Peter Walsh, the chief information officer, a man named Marcus Reed, and the head of physical security. Marcus had installed a temporary camera in the B2 corridor that afternoon, pointed at the door to the records storage closet. Maggie's voice in Diana's earpiece was flat and low. "He just came in, straight to B2, carrying a black nylon bag." They watched on the live monitor. Craig walked down the corridor with a bag in one hand and a small metal pail in the other. He entered the records closet. He emerged 3 minutes later, carrying the paper maintenance logs for the previous 18 months, a stack of folders 5 inches thick. He set them down on the concrete floor. He tore the pages out of the binders in handfuls, dropped them into the pail, and lit them. The burning took 15 minutes. Ash drifted onto the concrete and settled, the last physical record of the corroded ammonia valve and its 14-month history of deferred maintenance. Gone. Diana pressed both hands flat against the edge of the console. Peter said nothing. Marcus was already reaching for something. "There is one more thing," Marcus said. "I didn't mention it this afternoon because I wasn't sure it still worked, and I didn't want to give you hope I couldn't deliver. When I pulled the wiring schematics to choose where to mount this camera, I found a line in a 2009 drawing. An old dome unit, ceiling mounted in the B2 service corridor. Never decommissioned. Wires still live. It doesn't connect to the cloud system. It was installed before we had one. It runs on a standalone DVR hidden in the electrical cabinet at the end of the hall. 90-day loop." His face in the blue light of the monitor was very still. "If that unit has been running the whole time, it recorded the 14th. Marcus Reed led them down the stairwell to the B2 service corridor at 17 minutes past midnight. Craig had been gone for an hour. The pail had been emptied, the ash swept, the corridor wiped. A man cleaning up a crime always believes he has cleaned up everything. Marcus stopped in front of a gray electrical cabinet, mounted waist-high against the far wall. He took a small brass key from his pocket and turned it in the lock. Inside, behind a bundle of conduit, was a matte black box the size of a hardcover book. A single red LED on its front blinked in the steady 1-second rhythm it had blinked every second since the unit was powered on during the 2009 renovation. Nobody had touched it. Nobody had remembered it was there. It had been quietly running for more than 16 years, rewriting itself every 90 days, watching a stretch of corridor that mattered to no one, until it did. Marcus disconnected the drive and carried it upstairs in both hands, the way a man carries a bird he does not want to startle. At 12:10, in the 3rd-floor IT room, Diana stood behind Marcus's chair with Peter and Evelyn on either side of her and watched the footage begin to play. The camera's angle was wide. It took in the full length of the B2 conveyor zone and the corridor entry beyond it. The timestamp in the upper right corner read 2:09 in the morning, March 14th. Ethan Calloway walked into frame from the left. They watched him move through the zone with the controlled economy of a man trained to measure things. He held the handheld detector at 3 different heights. He bent close to the condenser plate. He raised his phone and filmed. The gauge, the plate, his own wristwatch. 30 seconds. He lowered the phone, crossed to the emergency cutoff, and placed his right hand on the red mushroom head. His lips moved. Peter, who had grown up in a family of deaf aunts and had learned to read lips before he had learned to read books, spoke the words aloud in the quiet of the room. Lockout. Tag out. Acknowledged. He pulled the breaker. At 2:19, Craig Donovan entered the frame from the right. He walked to the environmental control panel. He opened his laptop. In 89 seconds, Marcus paused the playback twice to confirm against the system audit log, which matched the footage second for second. Craig disabled 3 ammonia sensors one after another. He turned to face Ethan. He pointed at Ethan's chest. Peter leaned close to the screen, reading the slow movement of Craig's mouth. You have 2 options, Peter said quietly. Clean severance, or you stay. And you explain to OSHA why that little girl no longer has a father. Craig walked out of the frame. Ethan stood alone under the overhead fluorescents. For 10 seconds, he did not move. He did not look up at the ceiling. He did not scan the corners of the room. He did not know, in that moment, that a camera had ever been installed on the 2009 renovation. He simply stood there, breathing slowly, with the posture of a man who had understood, in the past 2 minutes, the exact shape of the cage he had just stepped into. Then he bent at the waist, picked up the handheld detector that had fallen to the concrete floor. At some point none of them had noticed, slid it into his jacket pocket, and walked out of the frame. The footage continued to run. Empty corridor, emergency exhaust still shrieking somewhere above. Diana pressed her palm flat against the monitor glass. Peter's voice came from somewhere behind her, barely above a whisper. He didn't know the camera was there. Diana did not turn from the screen. She was thinking about a conference room on the 14th floor and a man in a gray coverall who had looked at her for exactly 1 second across 8 feet of mahogany, and the category she had privately placed him in at the moment he signed. The category of a man protecting someone whose name must not appear in the record. She had been half right. The name he had been protecting was a 7-year-old girl with a bee in her hair. The hours that followed moved with the clean mechanical momentum of a system that had been held back too long. Peter called Bellamy at 1 in the morning. Bellamy called the Columbus field office of the FBI at 1:30. By 3, the video, the dome camera footage, the audit logs, the corridor burning sequence, and Evelyn's forensic walk were in the hands of a supervisory special agent who had spent 14 years working white-collar and industrial harm cases out of the same office. Craig Donovan was arrested at 6 the following Tuesday. 2 unmarked vehicles pulled up in front of his house in Upper Arlington. He answered the door in a bathrobe. He did not resist. Grant Thornton, the forensic firm Peter had retained, confirmed within 10 days what Evelyn had already found, and added the detail Diana had most needed to hear. The entity had been legitimate when her father signed the early retainers. The fraud had begun after his death. He had not known. He had simply died before the man he had trusted for 20 years decided the office down the hall no longer belonged to anyone who could stop him. Craig pled to 5 federal counts: wire fraud, willful OSHA violation, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, conspiracy to intimidate a witness, 78 months in federal custody, $4,300,000 in restitution, $1,800,000 in OSHA penalties. Permanently barred from serving as an officer of any publicly registered company. The man in the black coat was identified through intersection cameras and a car rental receipt he had been careless enough to pay with a personal credit card. 16 months on a federal stalking charge. OSHA re-entered B2 the morning after the arrest. The ammonia reading at the condenser face was 61 parts per million. The source was the corroded ball valve. Total repair cost, $280,000. The amount Craig had buried because it would have triggered a board conversation, and that conversation would have asked why nobody had caught it sooner. 20 workers had been in the building, or scheduled to enter it, in the 48 hours surrounding the incident. 20 people who had not known, would not have known, that a man they had passed in the hallway had stopped an event on their behalf that was already in motion. The Ohio Professional Engineer Board reviewed Ethan's file and issued an official advisory finding, the first of its kind in the board's records, that he had satisfied his statutory duty to report under the specific condition of a documented and active threat against a family member. Diana sent the company-wide message 2 days after Craig's arrest, 2 paragraphs, plain language. She had written it herself. There have been financial and safety violations at the highest executive level of this company. Federal authorities have been engaged. No employee has been harmed. We will make every record of what occurred available to every person who worked here during the relevant period. The final line was in her own voice. We will fix this. The board approved 4 structural changes in a single session, an independent compliance office reporting directly to the board, a new C-suite role, Chief Safety and Compliance Officer, with standing authority to halt operations in any condition of imminent hazard, a third-party whistleblower line, annual independent audits of every vendor contract exceeding $100,000. The Chief Safety and Compliance Officer position was offered to Ethan Callaway at a salary of $225,000. He accepted after 48 hours, during which, according to his sister in Cleveland, he did not speak to anyone except for the brief nightly phone calls he made to Sophie before she went to bed. The 20 workers each received a check for $15,000 and an invitation to a closed session in the ground floor cafeteria. Diana stood at the front of the room without notes and told them the story. When she finished, the people in the chairs in front of her stood up and did not stop clapping for a long time. Ethan and Diana met on a Sunday morning on the back porch of Maggie Doyle's small white house in Worthington. Maggie had invited them both without telling either that the other would be there. They sat on wicker chairs with coffee going cold between them. Neither of them spoke for 6 minutes. A cardinal called twice from the pin oak across the yard. Diana looked down at her hands. She looked up at Ethan. In that conference room, I looked directly at you and decided not to see you. I saw Craig. I saw the man I have called Uncle Craig since I was 12 years old, who came to every birthday, who gave the eulogy at my father's funeral. That was my failure, not the system's. Mine. Ethan listened. He did not look away from her. When he answered, his voice was quieter than she had expected. You have been chief executive for 4 years, in a company full of men who have been waiting for you to fail. If you had believed a maintenance worker over your chief operating officer at the first meeting, you would have lost the company by the end of the quarter. I am not angry with you. I understood where you were standing. I was standing in the same kind of room myself the night before. The silence between them was long, but not uncomfortable. I'm going to spend a lot of the rest of my life making sure nobody else has to stand in that room, she said. I know, Ethan said. That is why I took the job. Ethan moved out of the Franklinton studio at the end of April. The new apartment was a 2-bedroom in Clintonville, 6 blocks from a better school than Avondale, with a real bed for him and a real bed for Sophie. On the morning of the move, before the boxes arrived, he stood alone at the counter of the new kitchen with the white envelope from his old locker in his hands. For Sophie, in case. He had written it on a night, 6 months ago, when he had believed that preparing for the worst was the only honest thing a father could do for a motherless child. He held it for a long minute. Then he walked to the small fireplace at the end of the living room, struck a match, and watched the envelope burn on the grate. Unopened, unneeded, the last piece of a contingency that was no longer his contingency to keep. The ashes were still warm on the grate when Diana's car pulled into the driveway. She came in wearing an old flannel shirt that was 2 sizes too large on her. He recognized it as the kind of shirt a man of her father's generation would have worn on weekends. He did not mention it. She moved boxes with the quiet competence of a woman who had worked summers in her family's warehouse in high school and had never entirely stopped knowing how. Sophie, who had been delivered back from Cleveland the week before, walked carefully around Diana for the first hour, watching her the way she watched new birds in the yard. Around noon, without saying anything, she took Diana's hand and led her to a brown carton at the back of the living room. The carton was labeled in careful looping handwriting on the lid. Diana recognized the handwriting from a framed poem that Ethan had hung on the bedroom wall an hour earlier. It was his wife's. Sophie opened the carton. "Miss Diana, these are Mommy's things. Daddy says I can keep them." Inside were 3 objects. A pale blue cardigan, soft from years of wear. A small, worn paperback of Mary Oliver poems, the spine creased in 3 places. And an olive wood bracelet, the grain smooth and dark from the skin of a woman who had worn it every day. Sophie lifted the bracelet out of the carton in both hands. She held it up to Diana. "Mommy said this bracelet wants somebody to wear it. You hold it carefully, okay?" Diana knelt down on the floor of the half-unpacked apartment so that her face was level with the child's. She held out her wrist. Sophie threaded the bracelet on. It fit. Across the room, Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway holding a stack of plates, and he did not move for a long moment because he was afraid that if he moved, the thing he had just watched happen would become something ordinary. He kept his engineering license current and renewed it the following summer, through 2031. In the fall, Ohio State invited him to teach a part-time undergraduate seminar. He accepted. The course was listed in the catalog under a title he chose himself. When the system tells you to be quiet, 9 students registered for the first term. 19 enrolled for the second. Maggie Doyle refused the $50,000 retention bonus the board approved for her. She came to Diana's office on the day the offer letter arrived and set it back on the desk, still in its envelope. "Miss Harlow, I have everything I need. You do, too." A week later, a truck unloaded at the small white house in Worthington, a full planting of African violets, enough to fill every sunny window, because Maggie had once mentioned on her own porch that they had been her mother's flower when she was a girl. On the last Sunday of May, the 3 of them walked together through the Franklin Park Conservatory. The late afternoon light came slanting through the great glass roof of the palm house and turned the air a warm amber. Sophie ran ahead down the gravel path, chasing a yellow swallowtail butterfly that had drifted down from the ficus canopy. A second butterfly, a paler one, settled onto the shoulder of Diana's coat. Sophie turned. She stopped very still on the path. She raised one finger to her lips. "Don't move," she whispered. Diana did not move. Ethan stood a few feet behind her and watched them, his daughter on the gravel with her hand over her mouth, and the woman in front of him with sunlight in her hair and a butterfly on her shoulder and an olive wood bracelet on her wrist. And he thought of something he had said to Maggie late one night in the worst week of the whole affair, when he had not yet known how any of it would end. "I have prepared my whole life for the worst. I have never once prepared for the best." The butterfly lifted off Diana's shoulder and rose into the warm light under the glass. Sophie clapped her hands once. Ethan stepped forward. His hand found Diana's. She did not pull away, not in that moment, not ever again.